Okay, so one of the questions that runs through my research is, why are we not decarbonising fast enough? In fact, of course, we're increasing emissions. Now, political scientists have told us a lot about the role of interests and actors and institutions in why we're not decarbonising, let alone fast enough. We know much less about the role of ideas. There's some good work on the role of ideologies, particularly neoliberalism, as a barrier to decarbonisation. And there's some excellent work on particular types of policy instruments, particularly market-based mechanisms, looking at their conceptual and ideational foundations. My paper focuses somewhere in between those two things, between broad ideology and narrow policy instruments or instrument types. And it focuses on what I'm going to call a governance paradigm or governance paradigms. Namely, a governance paradigm is a constellation of positive and normative ideas that structures how groups of agents tend to think about the boundaries and causes of a social problem and about the appropriate responses to that problem. So it's similar to the idea of a policy paradigm that some of you might be familiar with, introduced by Peter Hall. But I prefer to focus in this context on governance rather than policy to indicate the inclusion of forms of social steering beyond the state. For instance, voluntary standards of corporate climate action. And my paper explores the role of climate governance paradigms in conditioning more or less effective forms of climate action. So I want to start by posing a question, or really two questions. Is Norway a climate leader? And is News Corp a corporate climate champion? How we answer these questions really depends on our climate governance paradigm. So under what I call the emissions paradigm, which has really dominated since climate governance efforts began in the early 1990s, under that under the emissions paradigm, climate change has been conceptualized as a problem caused by agents' greenhouse gas emissions. And the prescribed solution is for agents to disclose and reduce their emissions. This emissions paradigm inculcates a way of thinking and talking about climate agency that prioritizes agents' measurement and reporting of their emissions reduction efforts, and low emissions outcomes. So on the emissions paradigm, Norway is a climate leader. It has relatively low emissions, especially for a wealthy industrialized country. It generates nearly all of its electricity from renewable sources, has the world's highest share of electric vehicles in its automotive sector, and has a carbon price covering most of its domestic emissions. Indicators of climate leadership generated by respected organisations such as Carbon Tracker and the Climate Change Performance Index rate Norway among the best performing countries in the world. And also on the emissions paradigm, News Corp is a corporate climate champion. Sorry, forgetting to click my slides. So being a service sector business, its corporate operational emissions are relatively low. And it is intent on reducing them, as we can see here. The Swish sustainability page of its website touts its commitment to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. A commitment that was reviewed and validated by the Science Based Targets Initiative, an NGO that helps companies set ambitious science-based emissions reduction targets, end quote. Yet, anyone even faintly familiar with News Corp and Norway should feel an intuitive sense that something is amiss. Norway is Europe's largest exporter of petroleum. The overseas emissions from Norway's exported petroleum are almost 13 times its domestic emissions. Oil rents, moreover, have netted the Norwegian state a sovereign wealth fund currently worth US $1.6 trillion. If appropriately leveraged, that wealth could be invested overseas in ways that effectively decarbonise large swaths of the global economy. And surely News Corp's most consequential contribution to the climate crisis is not from the energy used to heat its office buildings, but from the content of the news media that comprises its core business. Many of the outlets in News Corp's media empire effectively campaign against climate policy, fomenting popular opposition to climate policies and to the groups and political parties that advocate them. An alternative news agenda that supported climate action could shift the climate attitudes and behaviour of tens of millions of people. So the climate governance paradigm we adopt shapes the way we think and talk about climate change, what we pay attention to and what we ignore, and what kinds of actions that we take or that we expect and encourage others to take. Now, in a context in which global emissions and the production, consumption of and investment in fossil fuels continue to rise, despite unprecedented commitments by corporations and governments to disclose their emissions and go net zero, it is timely to revisit our dominant ideas about climate governance. So in the rest of this presentation, I want to make a conditional case for the public instantiation in our modalities of climate governance and in our climate discourse of an alternative climate governance paradigm that I call the systems paradigm. And I should emphasize that I see the systems paradigm and the emissions paradigm as complementary, but that sequentially we need to focus primarily now on the systems paradigm. So I want to do 4 things, and I think I'll really only have time to do the first 2, but that's fine. I won't leave you sort of hanging in any crucial way. But broadly, the paper seeks to do 4 things. So, and today, first I'll explain what the systems paradigm is, what I mean by it, and I'll show how it illuminates the limitations of the emissions paradigm. Second, I will make my conditional case for publicly instantiating the systems paradigm. And I'll argue that it is more likely to incentivize and normalise forms of agency that are collectively effective at achieving desired climate goals. I'll try, if I have time, to say briefly a little bit about why, as I alluded to a second ago, why the emissions and systems paradigms are complementary and how the emissions paradigm retains an important role, albeit a more circumscribed one. And then fourth in the paper, but I won't have much time to do that today, I'll try to sketch some of the practical ways that I see the systems paradigm becoming instantiated, building on nascent initiatives that already exist and stepping stones to it. Okay, so the systems paradigm. So the systems paradigm, in kind of laying out the systems paradigm, I'm really drawing on 2 strands of literature. So the first is social and natural scientists working on climate change, who particularly in the last few years have drawn on concepts and methodologies from complex system science to propose alternative governance strategies focused on trying to tip high carbon systems into low carbon states. And secondly, though largely without talking to the first group, political theorists of structural injustice, typically drawing on the pioneering work of Iris Marion Young, have sought to better account for the structural causes of climate change in normative theorising about responsibility for climate injustice. So I think these 2 bodies of literature, kind of synthesising across them, yield 3 key insights, and I'll just summarise those now. So the first key insight is that systems and structures, and I'll use those terms interchangeably for now, that they matter. They matter causally and they matter morally. So the idea is that, in a causal sense, that social phenomena can and should be explained with reference not only to agents' actions, but also to the systems and structures in which agents act. The idea is that such systems and structures shape and constrain individual agency by determining the set of options from within which individuals choose and act. And they make certain options more or less attractive, thus channeling their agency in particular predictable directions. For example, in the climate context, various systems and structures shape the mobility options that agents have that are materially possible, legally permissible, economically prudent, and socially desirable, and thus channel behaviour along its well-furrowed path-dependent course, right? So we can think of material, infrastructural, kind of technological systems, as well as formal institutional systems like legal rules and regulations, as well as socio-cultural norms and values. And so while climate change may be proximately caused by agents' emissions, such as the agents driving their cars in this picture, it is conditioned, right? So conditionally caused by what I call emissions-conducive systems. Systems that incentivize and normalize emissions-producing behaviour. And so they channel that agency in emissions-producing directions. And as you can gather, the sort of primary mechanisms there are incentivization, so that emissions-producing behaviour is net beneficial for an agent, and normalisation, that emissions-producing behaviour seems the expected or at least the appropriate way to behave. Now, so that's the causal aspect of why systems and structures matter. But because of this causal force of emissions-conducive systems, it's often argued by theorists of structural injustice that agents have diminished moral responsibility for causing emissions than is relative to what's standardly assumed in the philosophical literature on climate responsibility. In the latter, autonomous agents are typically understood as autonomous and in control over key aspects of their lives, including their emissions, and so they're typically characterized as polluters who have the ability to not pollute. Whereas on the systems paradigm, agents are conceptualized relationally. They're understood as socially situated in the ways that I've outlined. And so a critique of the emissions paradigm then is that it insufficiently acknowledges the causal and moral significance of systems and structures that channel agents' behavior in emissions-intensive directions. The second key insight from these two literatures that I mentioned is that systems and structures are sticky, right? They're hard to dislodge. And that's because various components of these systems tend to reinforce one another, and so they stabilize carbon-intensive patterns of production and consumption. And this helps to explain why well-intentioned actions by individuals aimed at reducing their emissions often yield disproportionately low, often even zero returns in terms of emissions reductions. Whereas if climate change were merely a productive individual agency, then we would expect that a given agent's genuine efforts to reduce their emissions would yield proportionate emissions reductions. But think about someone who needs to use this highway system to get to work. They might spend a lot of time thinking about and planning alternative ways to get to work, but the options just aren't there. So there's a non-linear relationship between the investment of time and energy and other resources and the achievement of desired emissions reduction outputs. And this is an adapted version of a chart from Bernstein and Hoffman that kind of illustrates the relationship between the effort to decarbonize and the emissions reductions, right? So you can put a lot of effort in and not get anywhere, but at a certain point, when you hit on certain dynamics of the system, you can get very quick changes, you can get significant changes very quickly. And that's the second key part of this second insight, is that because of the interrelated nature of systems, they can actually be tipped and changed quite quickly. Okay. Yeah. But I think the sort of the final key point I wanted to make there is that what that means is it places a premium on understanding the dynamics of systems. So you can identify which aspects of the system make most sense to exert energy and expend resources on trying to change, so that you can increase the chances of hitting these tipping points. And then the third insight is that agents can either entrench or they can transform or try to transform the systems in which they operate. So this is really about trying to reconnect the systems approach to agents and agency. So through our agency within systems, we tend to continually reinforce those systems, right? So by driving on the highway system, we kind of increase demand for the cars and the petrol that we need in order to drive on the highway system, and make it more likely that governments will build more roads, etc. But of course, some do more than others to entrench harmful and unjust systems, and some could do more than others to transform those systems. And so an additional critique of the emissions paradigm is that explanatory analysis and normative evaluation on the emissions paradigm are deficient in that they omit to account for the actions of agents that entrench or could transform emissions-conducive systems. And that's kind of a more formalistic way of kind of theorising what I said at the start about Norway and News Corp, right? So essentially, thinking about the social causes of climate change and governance responses to it in this kind of way is essentially what I mean by the systems paradigm. Okay, so let me just take stock before I launch into my argument about the systems paradigm. So, we've got the emissions paradigm and the systems paradigm. They focus, in terms of their understanding of the problem of climate change, they focus on different things: agents emissions versus emissions-conducive systems. The solution is to disclose and reduce emissions on the emissions paradigm, whereas it's to understand and transform emissions-conducive systems on the systems paradigm. We're going from proximate to conditioning causes. We shift from autonomous agents and polluters to relationally understood agents acting in and on systems. And then some of the examples that I've already given about the emissions paradigm around emissions reporting and net zero. And I'll mention some other examples from the systems paradigm a little bit later. Right, so to the second part of my presentation, which is outlining my argument, my conditional case for the public instantiation of the systems paradigm. So without wanting to get too into the weeds, a little bit of terminological setup is needed for the argument. So I'm interested in two forms of climate agency, kind of two types of agency that I'm assuming agents can take to address, either to make climate change worse or to address it. So emissions-related agency, right? We can produce emissions, we can reduce emissions, or system-related agency, right? We can entrench systems or we can try to transform them. And what a given agent tries to do in terms of climate agency is going to be a product of their motivation and their capabilities. Okay, hopefully that's fairly uncontroversial. And that's relevant because I want to explain that I'm particularly interested in relatively capable agents, right? So particularly group agents like states, business corporations, NGOs, labour unions, and so on. So they're my primary agents of interest, those who have capabilities. And then within that, I'm interested in looking, first of all, at well-motivated agents, in the sense of agents who are highly motivated to take climate action of one form or another, either emissions or system focused. Neutral agents are those who don't have particularly strong views about climate change and not particularly taking action to address it, but nor are they high emitting. And then two categories of ill-motivated agents, so agents that are motivated to obstruct or not take action on climate change, including those that are relatively low emitting, like the News Corps of the world, right? And those who are high emitting, like the ExxonMobils or the AGLs of the world. And now, the way I'm going to make my argument for the systems paradigm is to look at how the emissions paradigm compared with the systems paradigm kind of structures the ways of thinking and acting of these different types of agents. And whereas on the emissions paradigm, we tend to focus down here, right? We focus on the high emitting agents because they have the most emissions. Whereas the approach that I'm going to take, it actually starts at the top, right? And so we focus much more up here, working with the agents who are highly motivated, and then thinks about how their actions can transform these, progressively kind of more winnable, if you will, agents. Just one final thing. I make a simplifying assumption that any given agent has sort of a fund of motivation that they're willing to spend on either emissions-related agency or system-related agency, and that they're sort of fairly fungible, right? So ExxonMobil has a very low fund of motivation. Friends of the Earth has a sort of high fund, right? So that's just a simplifying assumption. Okay, now let me get into the argument without further ado. So that's basically the first part of my argument, which is about the emissions paradigm. So let's look at the emissions paradigm first. So under conditions in which emissions-conducive structures or systems are entrenched, which broadly I think they are now, my argument is that the emissions paradigm incentivizes and normalizes agency that's ineffective, collectively ineffective at achieving our climate goals. And that it does so by generating social pressure on all agents to reflect and act upon only their emissions-related agency and not on their systems-related agency. So now let me kind of trace that through these different categories of agents that I just introduced. Okay, I'll come to that. Sorry, more coordination practice required. Okay, so let me start not with Scott Morrison, but with the well-motivated and the neutral agents. Okay, so under the emissions paradigm, well-motivated agents, again, think of environmental NGOs, they focus on pressuring the high emissions agents to disclose and reduce their emissions, but to ignore their own systems related actions and capabilities. And so they tend to do they focus on the kind of things that we hear all the time: stronger emissions reduction targets, more regulation of emissions, standards and rules about emissions reporting and emissions reduction. And the argument here is that this sort of rhetorical and substantive focus constrains the kinds of discursive frames and tactical repertoires, coalitions and resources that well-motivated climate actors can capitalize and can use, right? And so the idea is that because the emissions paradigm focuses on emissions alone, they have very limited possibilities for discursive framing, right? They have to be focused on this kind of relatively technical and abstract language of climate change and emissions. But most people don't see climate change as an urgent and proximate problem. And it's often particularly alienating for, say, like, voters and consumers who aren't sort of well-versed and don't have the kind of credentials to understand climate science in any detail. And I think this narrow focus also inhibits potentials for coalition building beyond the already climate alarmed, and therefore constrains the resources and tactical possibilities available to the climate movement. And in particular, they miss the opportunity to ally with neutral agents who might not be particularly concerned about greenhouse gas emissions, but because, agents, I'm thinking of particular agents like labour unions and so on, right, who may be able to form coalitions if the focus was broadened, and I'll elaborate on that in a minute. Okay, so broadly, campaigning for climate action on the emissions paradigm is hard, right? It's hard to kind of make progress. Now going to the ill-motivated low emissions agents, right, who have systemic power. So think of the news corporations of the world. So under the emissions paradigm, these type of actors get a free pass, okay? So think about the finance and professional services industries, banks, law firms, advertising and PR agencies, accounting firms, management consultancies, and media conglomerates like News Corp and Fox Corporation. Since their assets consist almost entirely of office buildings, IT systems, and humans sitting at desks, their direct emissions tend to be very, very minimal. And so it's quite easy for them to manage their emissions profile and project a positive image to the world about their commitments to net zero and sustainability leadership. However, many such firms simultaneously facilitate emissions growth and entrench emissions-conducive systems through their core business, the work they do for clients, or their media products, and so on. Now, again, so most obviously they do this through serving, particularly professional services firms, through serving emissions-intensive clients. But I also want to argue that they do this in less direct ways as well, not just by working for the fossil fuel industry. So they contribute to emissions-conducive systems and structures by assisting clients to do things that worsen economic inequality, undermine democracy, and weaken governments' capacities to tax, spend, and regulate, right? So think of things like offshore tax havens and so on that are facilitated by accounting firms and law firms, right? We don't tend to talk about that when we talk about climate change, but arguably these are systems and structures that facilitate continued emissions. And all of these activities remain out of focus on the emissions paradigm. And so these actors don't face any scrutiny or pressure, or relatively little, to transform their to transform the systems that they operate in. And finally, we come to ill-motivated high emissions agents, the usual suspect, the core focus of the emissions paradigm. They face an external environment in which emissions-conducive structures remain entrenched, so ex hypothesi. So it continues to be net beneficial and normal for them to emit, but they face this kind of pesky, annoying little scrutiny and social pressure to disclose and reduce their emissions. And consequently, they invest heavily in what I'm going to call emissions profile management. So they, rather than taking genuine steps to decarbonise, because these are costly and abnormal, they respond to this public pressure to disclose and reduce emissions by deliberately orchestrating the way that their emissions and their emissions mitigation efforts appear to relevant stakeholders. And they do this by using techniques with which we're all familiar, and I won't go into any great detail, but blame shifting and buck passing, making mere pledges or commitments rather than taking actions, setting long-term targets, the due date for which falls well into the future, right? Carve-outs, loopholes, offsets, techno fixes, etc. And an entire industry of carbon accountants, sustainability managers, and public relations experts has sprung up to service demands from business and states for these emissions profile management services. Meanwhile, they face a fairly favourable, from their perspective, environment in which to deploy their systemic capabilities to obtain and maintain a favourable kind of regulatory and socio-economic context, because no one's focusing on those on some of those things that I mentioned earlier around, you know, for instance, their ability to shield their assets from taxation and so on. Okay, so that's the first part of the argument. And the second part of the argument I'll be able to do quicker because it's basically kind of the flip side of that. So in terms of the systems paradigm now, the idea is that under conditions in which emissions-conducive systems are entrenched, publicly instantiating the systems paradigm would incentivize and normalize forms of agency that I argue would be more likely to be collectively effective at achieving our climate goals. And they would do so by generating social pressure on all agents to reflect and act upon their systems-related agency, and to identify and transform emissions-conducive systems and to pressure other agents to do so. So again, going through, and I'll go through a little more quickly this time so we can get to questions soon. So starting with the well-motivated agents. So under the systems paradigm, well-motivated agents will focus on identifying and transforming emissions-conducive systems. And this creates opportunities for them to link climate action and climate goals to other more salient issues, to communicate using more resonant frames and to forge wider coalitions and support bases, because they can address not only climate change, but other forms of maldistribution, oppression, and inequality beyond climate injustice. So for instance, by focusing on housing, energy, food, and mobility, and focusing not only on their problematic emissions implications, but also, you know, the way in which these systems are unequally structured and benefit relatively few at the expense of the many. And also focusing on cross-cutting systems such as political systems, media and communications systems, and financial systems that facilitate these both unsustainable, environmentally unsustainable and unequal systems. Okay, and I think the sort of paradigmatic example here is the sort of Green New Deal style climate programs that have been advocated, particularly in the United States. So now looking at the ill-motivated low emissions agents, so the News Corps of the world, under the systems paradigm, they're going to face pressure. They're going to face pressure for their actions to not only work for fossil fuel clients, propagate anti-climate messages and memes through their media products and so on, but also the work that they do to facilitate inequality and undermine democracy. And there are various nascent examples of work that's being done in this regard. And I'll just highlight a couple here. So there is some work focusing on banks financing. Clean Creatives focuses on advertising and PR agencies that do work for fossil fuel companies and tries to get them to stop doing that work. Law Students for Climate Accountability does similar with regard to law firms. And then you've got kind of the Green New Deal, and arguably the Inflation Reduction Act to some extent takes a much more systems focus, although of course it's not perfect. Okay, so let me just say something about the ill-motivated high emissions agents. So, as I said earlier, they're kind of they get the least attention on the systems paradigm, because we basically assume that they'll have the same motivation and use the same tactics that they do under the emissions paradigm, right? But the difference now is that they would face a different external environment, because emissions-conducive systems are being transformed around them. And so that should transform the incentives and the normalization to actually produce emissions. And arguably, that would be much more effective than trying to get them to reduce their emissions when they have these incentives to keep and norms to keep emitting. Okay, let me just say something briefly about why I think the emissions paradigm still has a role to play. And essentially, that role is that, and this is why my argument for the systems paradigm is conditional. It's conditional on, to the extent that emissions-conducive systems are entrenched. Because the whole point of trying to transform emissions-conducive systems is that by doing so, you then no longer normalize and incentivize emissions-producing agency. So as emissions-producing agency, if all goes well, becomes abnormal and net costly, right? Then arguably then the emissions paradigm has an important role to play in consolidating norms, moral and legal norms, for instance, against emissions, right? So it plays this kind of sort of consolidating function, because we want to have strong moral and legal norms against emissions, where it's, you know, just in the way that we have strong moral and legal norms against assault and murder, right? It's not normal and generally not net beneficial to kind of do those things, but we have norms in place that really reinforce that. And at the moment, the norms we're trying to introduce go against the grain of what's normal and net beneficial. Okay, so that's essentially the role that I envisage the emissions paradigm still playing. Now, of course, in different systems and different contexts, it might make more or less sense to focus on one or the other, right? So it's not like we universally focus on systems now and emissions later. It's going to be context specific. But nonetheless, I think a contribution of the paper is to outline the conditions under which we should focus more on one versus the other. I'll leave it there so we have enough time for questions. Yeah, thanks very much for your attention.
Yeah, thanks very much, Fergus. You've given a lot of food for thought. So I said we'll be opening questions from the floor and from online. So we'll start with in-person folks. So anyone have a burning question? Oh, goodness. Okay. Jackie, I'll keep you in line for the next time.
Hi, Fergus.
Hi, Jackie.
I'm going to ask you a question about litigation. But I'm interested in the question of what can be a disruptor.
Yeah.
I'm thinking we had yesterday rights, pays, all of this with a sort of I'm interested in what sorts of tools are useful.
Yeah, absolutely, Jackie. And I'd like to talk to you a bit more about this actually. But I think you can map litigation sort of on the spectrum from more emissions focused to more systemically focused, basically. And so I think like a good example of the latter might be litigation focused on, say, directors' duties in corporations, right? That sort of fundamentally tries to sort of restructure the nature of the corporation and corporate governance, which is going to be well upstream of any emissions that a company might produce, and sort of greenwashing probably somewhere in between. whereas I think, historically more of the focus has been on companies' emissions. But as you allude to, so even if we take sort of say someone like an ExxonMobil or something like that, they obviously have a lot of emissions. They also have a lot of systemic capabilities, and we're seeing now more litigation focused on their systemic role, the role that they've played in, these sort of collusion and conspiracy type cases. There's, cases about their, I think again, this is why I think sort of greenwashing could arguably be placed in that category. The kind of actions that they've done to sort of obstruct and delay climate policy. So I'd be kind of interested to maybe chat more with you about that framing and mapping that onto litigation. But I definitely agree that we can, or I think we can use that to conceptualize different types of litigation.
Theo, could you pull up a question from online for us?
I just need to turn on the mic.
Oh, sorry, that was my duty. There we go.
So this is an anonymous question. I'm interested in your proposition that emissions paradigms and systems paradigms are complementary and can coexist. To what extent does this coexistence undermine a shift to a systems perspective that encourages tactical shifts? Perhaps you can give an example about in what context does coexistence add value versus context where systems paradigm is the way to go?
Yeah, so I should probably just, I went through that very quickly at the end. So I suppose let me clarify. I think they sort of coexist in the way that, but at any one time, so for a given system or a given context, at any one time, we should be focusing more on emissions or more on systems. Okay, so I suppose I should be sort of looking up there at the camera. Yes, there. So rather than at Theo. So think about your sort of system in question, right? So maybe let's take the highway system from my earlier slide. Okay, so thinking about the emissions paradigm, if you're thinking about mobility for people who are connected to this highway system, you're probably not going to get very far, right? So that's an example of where you really want to be focused on the highway system and the surrounding kind of legal, technological, socio-cultural infrastructure that constitutes that system. Rather than sort of trying to get people to, drive less, right? That might have some impact at the margins, but that's not going to be the most sort of efficient use of kind of societal change resources, as it were, right? In terms of achieving emissions reductions, you're going to want to change the system. So I hope that clarifies that. I think they can coexist, but they coexist in a way that there will be different emphases in different contexts and at different points of time in one or the other. And I've tried to provide a sense of the conditions under which we should focus on one rather than the other.
Okay, so you already have got my eye. I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Amelia.
Amelia, you're next.
Fergus, thank you very much. That was fascinating. I have so many notes from your presentation. My name is Amelia. I'm a waste governance researcher from the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. And I was really intrigued about this concept that these two paradigms might interact. And indeed, it's sort of from your presentation, I got the sense that the emissions paradigm is sort of limiting and then at times consolidating a more systems paradigm shift. I'm wondering, systems paradigm seems like a bigger stakes, like a bigger shift in, changing norms as well as systems of operating. I'm wondering, is there a potential risk that we might shift into worse systems of operating rather than better? And I'm wondering if your research has explored, potential other futures with this change.
I suppose it's a good question. I suppose my assumption is that if we focus in a concerted way on transforming systems, we're probably more likely to get the systems we want than if we neglect that focus. Because I think there are certain agents who are focused on transforming systems, and they've done a pretty good job, but usually for the for the bad guys, right? So, I mean, the architects of the neoliberal order did a pretty good job at transforming systems, while the left was, I don't know, arguing amongst itself, and I don't know, but so I think there are agents who are trying to transform systems, and better that those of us who are motivated to tackle climate change try to transform them in a desirable way, I think. And I suppose the sort of third outcome, which is more what I was arguing against, is that we kind of just keep going along, focus relatively narrowly, almost exclusively on the emissions paradigm. And I fear that what we will get is just more and more emissions profile management, very little systemic change. And that's kind of what we've done for more than 30 years. And I feel like it hasn't really worked.
Okay, Theo, could you give us another
There's
question
nothing
from the
online
line?
at the
There
moment.
isn't? Okay, so Ben, I know you were next, and then got you two in mind.
Yeah, thanks, Fergus. So I want to pick up, you sort of mentioned about the role of ideas and sort of organisations producing ideas and how that might have an impact upon systems change. So universities have a particular role in terms of producing ideas.
Absolutely.
So have you thought about what this might imply for universities, and especially around perhaps our policies around the diversity of ideas that traditionally we have allowed under academic freedom? Are you suggesting that there might be some constraints, or what implications have you thought about that there might be for universities?
Yeah, great. No, it's a great question. And it's definitely something I've thought about a little bit, but want to focus more on. So what I'm, just to take a step back before directly answering your question, kind of what I'm hoping to do with this paper is set out the broad arguments. There'll be a few examples along the way to make things concrete, but it's really sort of it's quite a big picture paper. And then what I would like to do is write more specific papers focused on key types of actors with people who have thought a lot more about that particular actor, right? And universities is definitely one in that category. Labour unions is another one I'm particularly interested in and doing some work with others on in a different project. You know, NGOs, obviously, that are sort of open-minded about this kind of stuff. Think tanks, potentially even governments, right? Perhaps more local or state governments. So I think that work kind of still needs to be done. But I think broadly, and this was the kind of last thing that I didn't quite get to, right? Sort of how do we get to the systems paradigm? I think we really need to work with these types of agents to do things like to develop the analytical tools and methods and tailor them to that particular type of agent, to do things like to map emissions-conducive systems and develop an understanding of the dynamics and leverage points in their systems, to take further research to fill gaps in understanding those systems, understand that type of agent's position within those systems and their capabilities to transform them, and then actually identifying and prioritising system transformative interventions that they can undertake. And then I think sort of we're trying to work with like champion organisations, if you will, who can then kind of develop the playbook, develop and of course, a lot of this stuff, there's huge resources in terms of systems thinking and so on that's out there already, right, that can be applied, just needs a bit more application. And then sort of to try and popularise that way of thinking amongst agents of a similar type, whether it be through the group of 8 or, union confederations and so on. So specifically, to come to your question, what that might look like for the university is, I'm sure we'll all have different ideas about this. And I think the universities that are at the leading edge of sustainability are really thinking more than just, so the emissions paradigm sort of version, which is what most universities do, is let's reduce our carbon footprint, right? And that can be powerful, particularly because that can have systemic effects, right? Because students come and they see how that's done, and then they can go and take that knowledge away. So I think universities should be laboratories in reducing their own emissions, but largely more because of their system effects, rather than, universities, I guess, have a significant carbon footprint, but I think their systemic role is much broader. And so that then you're obviously looking at their educational function and what gets taught and the research that gets done. And I'm sure we'll all have different ideas from our different disciplines about what that might look like. But it's that taking that systemic approach. I think universities are a really good example of where that can make a big difference.
Yeah, any other questions popping up?
Yeah, there's one from Dan Hill. Have you looked at some specific sectors such as built environment and housing, for example, which are often treated as if completely separate to climate policy, i.e. new housing targets are produced as housing policy, which have a huge impact on greenhouse gases and biodiversity impact, and yet also completely separate to climate policy? Are they good examples of bringing together the systemic impacts across government policymaking anywhere, noting the global impact of local development?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is, I think, another example of kind of the more specific work that needs to be done. And I think to some extent is being done, right? So people, like I said, the more applied kind of papers and not just papers, kind of work that I want to be done beyond this, we'll be working with people who are already doing this. So I think the housing sector is a good example. And if we go back to the idea of a Green New Deal, housing is often centered in Green New Deal policy programs. So I think if you even going to like the Ocasio-Cortez-Markey Green New Deal resolution in the US, well, the first follow-up to that, I think, was a Green New Deal for housing. And so they're looking at housing, the role of housing, not just as a source of emissions, but as a kind of essential, essential kind of human need, really, and then thinking about not, the aspects that are relevant to that are beyond the climate system. So the affordability, cost of housing, accessibility of housing, quality of housing, rental rights, and so on. So taking that holistic approach with regard to different systems of provision like housing, mobility, food, energy, and so on is, I think, exactly what needs to be done, and integrating climate with the other aspects of policy that affect that area. So I can't remember the question's name, but it sounds like that they've done more thinking about this on the housing front. And I think, like I said, there are people doing this, but generally in terms of like in government, yeah, they do tend to be siloed. And as a result, we have a lot of policies that are not thought about as climate policies, but that end up directly or indirectly leading to more emissions, as well as poor socioeconomic outcomes.
Right, we're getting towards the end. You are next, and once you ask your question, if yours is linked, you can pose it as well. We can get it answered in one fell swoop.
Thanks. Really interesting talk, thank you. I think one of the question I'm asking is, have you already seen some sectors already making this shift? In particular, I think the climate movement, I would suggest, has already made this shift because they've seen that the emissions paradigm doesn't actually work. Like to link to Jackie's question, I think the reason why litigation has shifted from the emissions paradigm to the systems paradigm is because litigation against emissions didn't really work. Those kind of cases didn't fly. So now it's actually about targeting the system and system change. And I think not all of the movement has changed, but I think a lot of the climate movement has already made that shift. And I wonder if you see this in other spaces too. I think one of the places this is really needed is within the UNFCCC. I think that's where this shift really needs to take place. But I think, are you seeing it already?
Is your question similar or different?
I mean, there's a bit of it that's similar. I'll just stick to that.
Let's hear it as well.
So, I mean, just adding to what was just said and also Amelia's question, I mean, my research also kind of looks at how the social contract influences system change.
Yeah.
But what I was kind of curious about is like, this link between this emissions paradigm and systems paradigm. Because one example that came to mind as you were speaking was the degrowth paradigm. So you have this emissions paradigm, people have taken that and said, okay, you know what, if we want to transform this into a systemic paradigm, it's degrowth. And at least in my research, it's not a very mature idea, and it's unlikely to attract an effective coalition as well. It's, basically emissions paradigm with a facade of systems change. Have you seen examples of that? And like, if that's actually the case, how do we guide real systemic change that's not just a facade, something more that takes into account those complex emergent properties?
Great. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Let me try and answer those two. So as the first question, so have I seen examples of sectors making this shift? I mean, yes, I think you're absolutely right. There are examples, and these are some of them. I think even looking at these examples, so take in particular, say, actually these three, right? They focus on the fossil fuel industry, and I think obviously rightly so. So they focus on creatives work for fossil fuel clients, law firms work for fossil fuel clients, bank financing and fossil fuels. Great. And what I think needs to happen more is looking at the other work that they do that I alluded to, right? Corporate tax shielding and work that professional services sort of industries do that facilitates, worsens inequality and undermines democracy, basically. So I think that needs to be more of a focus. I mean, one way of sort of conceptualizing this, I didn't have time to go into this, is to sort of think these are almost scope 3 emissions type focuses, which I think provides an interesting bridge between the emissions paradigm and the systems paradigm. Sort of still uses the language and techniques of emissions management, but it's much more relational. You're moving beyond the confines of the operational control of an organization or a state, or, you know, and into thinking about their supply chains and their wider impacts on the world. So it's a sort of, I think scope 3 emissions provide an interesting bridge, and something I want to do on the paper is precisely because I think, you know, people will say, oh, but what about scope 3 emissions? No one said it yet, but your question comes closest to it. And so I want to be like, yeah, I see it as a bridge. It's partly there and partly still stuck in the emissions paradigm. So yeah, but happy to kind of talk more afterwards. But I think there are examples that we can build on, and I definitely want to illustrate that these are kind of non-mainstream but present currents that we can build upon, rather than something that's completely unheard of. And then to answer your question, yeah, so I think you could think about degrowth as sort of one you know, relatively sort of coherent approach to taking a systems approach, right? So, but definitely not, and I know you weren't suggesting this, not synonymous with it, or not the only approach. So it's more specific, but I think it would be a kind of a species of systemic approach, I guess. And yeah, you alluded to some of the, I think, challenges that particular approach faces in terms of building movements, real world political movements for change and so on. Yeah, I think, yeah, maybe I'm not sure if I've answered the nub of the question, but yeah.
You can follow up.
Yeah, great.
Sure. We've got about 1.5 minutes left.
Yeah.
Maybe after, were there any more online ones coming up there?
There's one more online one, but
Well,
yeah.
We do owe the onliners a last question, and then we can come up afterwards and ask questions at the end.
Oh, it's actually more of a comment actually on the previous question from Dan. So I might just share it with you afterwards.
Okay.
Good. Well, one more from the floor. It's a quickie.
Yeah. Well, it's not too. No, I'll go afterwards. Yeah.
Okay.
Quickie from the back, the very back.
I hope it's quickie. You spoke at the beginning a bit about Norway, but then the rest of the talk sort of moved to corporates, and a lot of the conversation's been around corporates. Have you done much thinking about the distinctions that may exist for this framework between corporates or small groups or even individuals, as opposed to states or sovereigns?
Yeah, no, good question, actually. I think that's something that I wanted to say a little bit more of, but kind of we didn't get to. So I'm glad I've got the last word on that. So I think because states, given the nature of like states' emissions, are kind of largely not their own emissions, they're like boundary of operational control is like their territory. So actually a lot of the things that states do can be seen in terms of the emissions paradigm. I think one area in which there has been more of a focus on systems historically is around like energy infrastructure and technology, you know, so renewable energy targets and so on being an obvious example. So again, that's I think an area where there has been a lot of thinking done about systems and right already. Less, I think, has been done on the kind of normative and institutional kind of systems. So, but I think you're right, because of just the nature of a state and their relationship to emissions means that I think there's sort of analogies, but we need to be a little bit careful with those. And certainly in the paper, I do intend to say a little bit more about that. But I think broadly, I think that it translates. I just think there are sort of a few nuances. But I think the examples I gave at the start about Norway's export-oriented emissions and the potential of its sovereign wealth fund to be used to transform emissions elsewhere, the fact that they're occluded and neglected on the emissions paradigm, I think, is a pretty significant indictment. And obviously, there's parallels there to Australia, given its export-oriented coal and gas and its potential of its renewable energy to serve as a base for decarbonisation in our region.
Thanks very much. Alas, we're out of time. So just a reminder that this event is recorded on the university's YouTube channel. Before I thank Fergus, I'd like to thank Theo Mendes for all the hard work in organising this and meeting and greeting and tic-tacking and all the rest of it. Thank you, Theo. And last but not least, Fergus, thanks so much. It's great to have you back in our midst. There will be future events coming up. We have one more place left in our climate change and populism workshop. You'll see an advertisement for that on MCF's website. And Fergus is also giving a presentation on democracy and decarbonisation, or deliberative democracy and decarbonisation. So you can pop over to us at the end of this seminar to find out a bit more about that. Thanks very much to you for coming along, and also for those who have tuned in online. Thank you.